Hello, my friends. I hope this message finds you in a moment of stillness wherever you are in the world right now. And I want to thank you for trusting me with a few precious minutes of your time to discuss something the international community would rather you never fully understand. Tonight we are going to talk about money, the kind of money that doesn't appear in budgets or official reports, the kind that flows through shadows and finances the very chaos that keeps Africa on its knees. Because across Mali, across the Sahel, across the territories where Ibrahim Traoré and his brothers in arms are fighting for something the world calls radical, but Africans call survival, there is a war being funded. And the African Union has finally decided to expose it. This is the Africa news story that will make you question every headline you have ever read about insurgencies, terrorism, and instability on the continent. Because what if I told you that the chaos tearing through Mali is not random? What if the fuel blockades, the militant attacks, the carefully timed disruptions are all part of a system designed to keep Africa dependent, divided, and desperate? Stay with me, because what you are about to hear will not just anger you, it will wake you up. And if you want to keep following this story as it unfolds, as the African Union finally takes action, as Burkina Faso and Mali refuse to back down, then consider subscribing. Because this channel is where the truth about Africa's fight for sovereignty lives, and you will not find this perspective anywhere else. Let us start with something that should disturb every person who believes in justice. For years, the world has been told that Mali is collapsing under the weight of jihadist violence, that groups like JNIM and other al-Qaeda affiliates are simply religious extremists driven by ideology and chaos. But that narrative, my friends, is a lie. And it is a lie that has been incredibly profitable for those who peddle it. The insurgencies ravaging Mali are not accidents of history. They are investments. Carefully calculated investments by forces that profit from Africa's suffering. You see, when a convoy is attacked outside Bamako, when a fuel truck is burned on the highway, when markets go dark and hospitals run out of power, someone somewhere is making money. Insurance companies in Europe raise premiums on African routes. Security contractors in Washington get new billion-dollar deals to stabilize regions they helped destabilize. Mining companies renegotiate contracts at lower rates because governments are desperate for any revenue during crisis. Chaos is not the problem for these entities. Chaos is the business model. And for decades, Africa has been the store that never closes. But here is where the story takes a turn that terrifies the old powers. The African Union, long dismissed as ceremonial, as symbolic, as powerless, has finally begun to connect the dots. In recent months, AU investigators have been quietly tracing financial networks that fund militant operations across the Sahel. And what they are discovering is not just disturbing, it is explosive. Because the money funding these insurgencies does not come from caves in the desert or from radical preachers in distant lands. It comes from shell companies registered in tax havens. It comes from resource extraction deals that require instability to remain profitable. It comes from the same international financial system that claims to be fighting terrorism while feeding it with one hand and condemning it with the other. The African Union has discovered that Mali's suffering has a budget, and that budget is being paid by people who smile in diplomacy meetings while signing checks for destruction behind closed doors. If that revelation shakes you, good, because discomfort is the price of awakening, and Africa is waking up faster than the world ever anticipated. Now, let me take you deeper into the mechanics of this hidden war, because understanding how it works is understanding why leaders like Ibrahim Traoré are treated as threats by the very nations that claim to support African development. When Mali began pushing back against foreign military presence, when Burkina Faso under Traoré's leadership started demanding sovereignty over its resources, when Niger joined the alliance of Sahel states and said enough is enough, something predictable happened. The insurgencies intensified, fuel blockades tightened, security incidents multiplied. And international media immediately framed it as proof that African leadership was failing, that these young military governments were reckless, that sovereignty was the problem rather than the solution. But the African Union investigators saw something different. They saw a pattern. Every time an African nation moved toward independence, every time a government cut ties with exploitative contracts, Every time a leader like Traoré said we will control our own uranium, our own gold, our own future, the violence escalated. Not because of ideology, but because of economics. Because a stable, sovereign Mali is worthless to those who profit from instability. A Burkina Faso that controls its own mining sector is a nightmare for corporations that have been extracting wealth for pennies on the dollar for generations. A unified Sahel that refuses external military bases, that builds its own energy corridors, that trades with partners of its own choosing, that is not a security threat, that is an economic threat. And economic threats get neutralized through methods the public never sees clearly. This is why the fuel blockades in Mali were never just about logistics. They were pressure points, designed to create suffering that could then be blamed on the government. You strangle a capital, you make people desperate, and then you point to the chaos you created as evidence that African leadership is incompetent. It is a script as old as colonialism itself. Engineer the crisis, then blame the victim, then offer salvation in the form of the same systems that caused the suffering in the first place. But here is what the architects of that script did not anticipate. The people of Mali did not collapse. They adapted. Neighborhoods became economies. Communities shared resources. Mechanics invented fuel alternatives. Teachers held classes without electricity. And in that resilience, something more dangerous than any insurgent group was born. The realization that survival is possible without permission from external powers. That realization is what keeps Western strategists awake at night, because a population that discovers it can endure artificial scarcity becomes ungovernable through traditional leverage. You cannot intimidate people who have already lived through the worst you can engineer. You cannot bribe nations that have learned to function with nothing. And you cannot manipulate governments backed by populations who finally see the invisible hand that has been choking them for generations. This is the environment in which Ibrahim Traoré rose to prominence. Not through propaganda, not through foreign backing, but through resonance with a generation of Africans who are exhausted by the perpetual victimhood narrative. Traoré looked at Mali's blockades and said, "Never here, not in Burkina Faso." He fortified supply chains before they could be weaponized. He militarized transit routes before they could be sabotaged. He cut out the middlemen in procurement systems that had long served foreign interests more than African populations. And by doing so, he did not just prepare his nation for crisis, he invalidated the tools that make crisis profitable. That is why the global reaction to Traoré has been so hostile, so immediate, so coordinated, because competence in African leadership is more destabilizing to the old order than any amount of chaos. A capable Africa removes the foundation of centuries of exploitation, and when the African Union began tracing the money behind Mali's insurgencies, when they started publishing findings that connected dots between resource contracts and militant financing, when they finally said out loud what everyone suspected but no one dared confirm, the world reacted with the kind of panic reserved for truths that cannot be unsaid. Suddenly, reports emerged warning about dangerous nationalism in the Sahel. Think tanks in Washington published papers about the risks of African sovereignty movements. European media began framing the AU's investigation as conspiracy theory, as anti-Western bias, as dangerous populism. But none of that changed the evidence. Shell companies traced back to European financial centers. Mining contracts signed during conflict periods at rates that only make sense if instability is permanent. Arms flowing into the region through channels that somehow bypass every international monitoring system. Humanitarian aid diverted into logistics networks that supply the very groups it is supposed to be protecting populations from. The AU did not discover a smoking gun. They discovered an entire arsenal. And that arsenal has serial numbers that lead back to boardrooms in Paris, London, and New York. Now, I want you to feel the weight of what this means for the future, because we are not just talking about historical grievances or abstract theories of exploitation. We are talking about a system that is functioning right now, today, as you listen to these words. Somewhere in Mali, a convoy is being delayed by militants who are paid through financial networks that investigators can trace. Somewhere in Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré is making decisions knowing that every move toward true sovereignty will be met with escalation. designed to look organic, but funded with precision. Somewhere in Niger, leaders are calculating whether they can survive the next wave of orchestrated instability or whether they will be forced back into compliance through sheer exhaustion. This is not ancient history. This is the present tense reality of Africa's fight for independence. And the African Union's decision to finally expose the financial architecture behind the insurgencies is not symbolic. It is a declaration of war against a system that has treated African blood as a renewable resource. But here is where hope emerges from the darkness, fragile but undeniable. The fact that this conversation is happening at all. The fact that the AU is investigating. The fact that leaders like Traoré are refusing to kneel. The fact that populations across the Sahel are choosing resilience over surrender. All of this signals a tectonic shift that no amount of money can reverse. Because once a people see the chains clearly, once they understand that their suffering is not fate but design, once they recognize that independence is not a gift to be granted but a right to be seized, the old order loses its most powerful weapon, which is the illusion of inevitability. For decades, Africa was told it could not survive without external management, that sovereignty was a luxury poor nations could not afford, that dependence was simply the price of development. But Mali under siege did not collapse. Burkina Faso under pressure did not break. Niger under isolation did not beg for rescue. And that survival, that stubborn, magnificent survival, is rewriting the rules of global power faster than any military campaign ever could. The road ahead is not easy, and I will not pretend otherwise. The forces that profit from Africa's chaos have centuries of practice and bottomless resources. They will not surrender their positions simply because they have been exposed. They will adapt, rebrand, create new mechanisms of control that look like partnership but function like exploitation. They will fund new crises, engineer new emergencies, and frame every African success as a fluke and every African struggle as proof of incompetence. But they are operating now in a fundamentally different environment because the narrative has shifted. Africans are no longer asking why we suffer. They are asking who benefits from our suffering. And that question, once asked sincerely and investigated thoroughly, leads to answers that no amount of propaganda can obscure. The African Union's exposure of hidden money behind Mali's insurgencies is not the end of the story, it is the beginning of accountability. And accountability is the one thing that systems built on exploitation cannot survive. So let me leave you with this final thought, something to carry with you as you navigate the headlines that will try to bury this story, that will try to dismiss it as conspiracy or nationalism or anti-Western bias. Ask yourself why the revelation that insurgencies are funded makes people uncomfortable. Ask yourself why African sovereignty is framed as radical rather than natural. Ask yourself, who benefits when Mali stays weak, when Burkina Faso stays dependent, when the Sahel stays in chaos? And when you find those answers, when you trace those benefits back to their sources, you will understand why leaders like Ibrahim Traoré are called dangerous, why the African Union's investigation is downplayed, why this entire story is something the world does not want you to fully comprehend. Because the greatest threat to centuries of exploitation is not violence, it is clarity. And Africa is becoming dangerously clear about who has been writing its history and who will write its future. If you want to follow this story as it develops, as the African Union continues its investigation, as Burkina Faso and Mali push forward despite every obstacle, as the truth about Africa's struggle becomes impossible to ignore, then subscribe to this channel, because this is where you will find the perspective that mainstream media refuses to platform. This is where Africa's awakening is documented without apology or compromise. Until next time, my friends, stay alert, stay informed, and stay awake to the truth the world does not want you to see.